In the Acts of the Apostles, the Apostle Paul stands on Mars Hill in Athens and declares, "From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth." This profound statement, that all of humanity springs from a single source, is a cornerstone of biblical thought. Yet, within the Bible's very first book, a mystery unfolds that seems to challenge this idea at its core, a puzzle that has perplexed readers for millennia: the identity of Cain's wife. The story, as told in Genesis, begins with a stark simplicity. God forms the first man, Adam, and from Adam's own side, creates the first woman, Eve. They are the progenitors of all humankind. After being exiled from the Garden of Eden, they have two sons, Cain and Abel. At this point in the narrative, the named population of Earth is precisely 4. Then, in the first act of human-on-human violence, a jealous Cain murders his brother. The world's population drops to 3, Adam, Eve, and their murderous son. The logic is straightforward, the numbers are clear. But just a few verses later, the narrative takes a turn that has baffled generations. After receiving his judgment and punishment from God, Cain leaves his parents and travels to the land of Nod, east of Eden. And then, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, we read a seemingly innocuous line that throws everything into question: Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Wait a minute. His wife? Where did she suddenly come from? If the only known people on the planet were Cain and his parents, the appearance of this woman is a monumental, unexplained event. Who was she? Where did she come from? Who were her parents? Does this mean the creation story we've always understood is incomplete? Could there have been other tribes, other humans, living outside of Adam and Eve's family? If so, doesn't the entire foundation of a common human origin, a shared story beginning in Eden, completely fall apart? Today, we are going to attempt to solve what might be called the Bible's first great cold case. But before we dive into theories, let's go back to the text itself, to Genesis chapter 4, and feel the raw terror and desperation that gripped Cain after he committed his crime. Many people think Cain's punishment was merely exile, but that's a superficial reading. A closer look at the dialogue between God and Cain reveals details that are both crucial and frequently overlooked. God asks Cain, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." And then comes the curse, "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." This is a terrifying sentence. For a farmer like Cain, the land no longer yielding its strength meant the loss of his very means of survival. But even more profound are the words, "a fugitive and a wanderer," painting a picture of a man doomed to a life of rootless wandering, forever without a home. Cain's response to this verdict provides our first, and strangest, clue. He cries out to God, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Let that last phrase sink in: whoever finds me will kill me. It's a chilling statement. If the only other people in the world were his own mother and father, who exactly is this whoever that Cain fears? Was he afraid of wild animals? That seems illogical. This single sentence strongly implies that in Cain's mind, other human beings existed on earth. And what's more, he believed these people, upon discovering his crime of fratricide, would seek revenge. This seems to point our investigation directly toward the most audacious and paradigm-shifting possibility, the Pre-Adamite hypothesis. This theory proposes that at the time God created Adam and Eve, or perhaps in regions outside the specific Garden of Eden, other primitive human races already existed. These people were not descendants of Adam and were separate from the main storyline of Genesis. According to this hypothesis, when Cain was exiled, he entered the territory of these people. The ones he feared were these Pre-Adamites, who might avenge Abel's death. And, consequently, the wife he later married was a woman from one of these tribes. The idea of Pre-Adamites appeared in various scattered forms in antiquity and the Middle Ages, but it was systematically articulated in the 17th century by a French thinker named Isaac Le Pereire. He used the theory to explain apparent contradictions in the biblical text, such as the origin of Cain's wife and the existence of different human races. On the surface, the pre-Adamite hypothesis seems like the perfect solution to our mystery. It's simple, direct, and instantly fills the logical gap. Who did Cain fear? Pre-Adamites. Where did his wife come from? The Pre-Adamites. The problem seems to vanish in an instant. But a solution that appears too perfect often conceals deeper, more fatal flaws. When we place the pre-Adamite hypothesis back into the grand narrative of the entire Bible, we discover that far from solving the problem, it triggers a catastrophic collapse of theological and logical coherence. First and foremost, it directly assaults two of the Bible's most central doctrines: the single origin of humanity and the concept of original sin. The biblical worldview insists that all of humankind, regardless of continent or skin color, shares a common ancestor, Adam. It is precisely because Adam acted as the representative head of humanity that when he chose to disobey God in Eden, sin entered the human condition and was passed down through the generations. This is what we call original sin. The Apostle Paul lays this out with crystal clarity in the book of Romans, where he writes, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." This verse is the bedrock of the entire Christian doctrine of salvation. It explains why all of humanity is in need of redemption, because we all inherited a state of sin from a single source. But if pre-Adamites truly existed, this entire logical framework instantly disintegrates. Were these pre-Adamites descendants of Adam? No. Did they, therefore, possess original sin? If they didn't, were they perfect and immortal? This clearly contradicts everything we know from history and observation. If they did have sin, where did their sin come from? Taking it a step further, if Jesus came to earth to offer salvation to the descendants of Adam, would that salvation extend to these pre-Adamites? You see, a theory proposed to solve a minor textual detail ends up demolishing the entire core message. It's like trying to explain a discolored brick on a building by concluding that the building has no foundation at all. The cost is far too great. Beyond this, the pre-Adamite hypothesis simply lacks textual support. When the Bible describes the origin of humanity, its tone is definitive and singular. Genesis details God's creation of Adam, and then states, "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." Later, it says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." Throughout this entire narrative, there is not a single hint or suggestion of other human branches existing outside of Adam's family. So, while the pre-Adamite hypothesis has offered a convenient, if speculative, answer for many throughout history, it remains a ghost that cannot be integrated into the Bible's own system. It is a fascinating theory, an imaginative idea, but one that the text itself rejects. It seems we are back at square one. But a failed attempt is not without value. It has taught us that the real answer must be hidden within the familiar framework of the story, not outside of it. For now, let's set aside these speculative flights of fancy and return to the scene of the crime, the text of Genesis itself. We've already realized that the key to this mystery may not lie in inventing new people, but in correcting a potential misunderstanding of two fundamental elements of the story: time and family. First, let's talk about time. When modern people read these ancient narratives, we often fall into a trap of linear time illusion. We are accustomed to the tight, fast-paced narrative rhythm of modern film and television, where one event follows another with little pause. So, when we read about Cain killing Abel, being exiled, and then marrying and having a child, we subconsciously assume these events happened in quick succession, perhaps over just a few years. But in doing so, we overlook a background detail in the early chapters of Genesis that is completely subversive to our modern sense of time: the astonishingly long lifespans of the first humans. According to the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, Adam lived to be 930 years old. His son Seth lived 912 years, and Seth's son Enosh lived 905 years. These are lifespans nearly 10 times longer than our own. Whether we take this detail literally or symbolically for a moment is beside the point, as it is the stated background of the story, we must factor it into our analysis. For a person who can live for over 900 years, what age is considered adulthood? What would the rhythm of their life be like? How old was Cain when he murdered Abel? The Bible doesn't say. Some traditional Jewish sources speculate that Cain may have already been over 100 years old. Regardless of his exact age, one thing is certain: the period between him killing Abel, being exiled, and eventually marrying and starting a family in the land of Nod could have been an incredibly long time, perhaps several decades, or even a century or two. And in that vast expanse of time, long enough for a modern dynasty to rise and fall, what kind of demographic changes would have occurred in Adam and Eve's family? This leads us to our second, and most crucial, clue: family. Our mental image of Adam's family is often fixed on the parents and their three famous sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth. But this is a profound misunderstanding, one rooted in our failure to notice a vital verse that helps unlock the entire puzzle. This clue is hidden in Genesis chapter 5, verse 4. After recording that Adam fathered Seth, the text adds a seemingly mundane but information-rich statement: the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. The words, "and he had other sons and daughters," are like a flash of lightning, instantly illuminating the whole foggy mystery. It tells us a fact that has been overlooked for ages: Adam and Eve absolutely did not have only 3 sons. Over their incredibly long reproductive lives, spanning some 800 years after Seth's birth, they were continuously having children, bringing forth many, many sons, and also many, many daughters. The biblical author wasn't trying to provide a detailed census report. The narrative selectively records only those male descendants who play a key role in the grand historical through-line of the Old Testament, such as Seth, who replaced Abel. It was from Seth's lineage that the promised Messiah would eventually come. The daughters and other sons whose names are not recorded weren't non-existent, they were simply omitted for the sake of the author's narrative purpose. Now, let's combine these two clues, the vast timeline and the large family, to reconstruct the scenario. Let's assume Cain was around 100 years old when he killed Abel and was exiled. In those first 100 years, his parents, Adam and Eve, could have already given birth to dozens of other children, both sons and daughters. And these children, in turn, over their own long lives, would have begun to have children of their own. So, by the time Cain was driven out, the human population on earth was far from the 3 people we imagined. It was likely a burgeoning clan, a large extended family of dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of blood relatives. The "whoever," in Cain's fearful cry, "whoever finds me will kill me," was not some mysterious pre-Adamite. It was most likely his own brothers or nephews, people who had every reason to seek justice for their murdered kinsman, Abel. This also explains why God placed a mark on Cain. It was a protective measure. God was shielding Cain to prevent anyone who met him from killing him. This mark was essentially a grant of judicial immunity within this small, emerging human society. With this understanding, the identity of Cain's wife becomes clear. She was, without a doubt, a member of this large, extended family of Adam and Eve's descendants. In other words, she was either Cain's own sister or, perhaps, a niece. This is the only logically consistent conclusion we can draw from the internal evidence of the text. It requires no external, speculative additions. It is rooted entirely in the Bible's own narrative logic and background setting, even if this conclusion presents an emotional and psychological challenge to our modern sensibilities. I know that when the answer, "Cain married his sister," is spoken aloud, the first reaction for many is to cringe. There's an instinctual resistance and discomfort. In our civilization, close kin marriage, especially between siblings, is strictly forbidden as incest, an act condemned not only on moral grounds but also proven to carry significant genetic risks. And you're probably asking, was the biblical author condoning or even encouraging this practice? To answer that, we have to break a mental habit. We cannot impose our modern standards on an ancient and unique situation. We must understand that specific historical context on three distinct levels. First is the biological level. We all know today that close-kin marriage is risky. This is because modern genetics teaches us that every person's genome carries a few harmful recessive disease-causing genes. When two unrelated people have children, the chances of these harmful genes matching up and being expressed are incredibly low. But in a marriage between close relatives, who inherited their genes from a common ancestor, the probability of them both carrying the same harmful gene increases dramatically. As a result, the risk of their offspring having a genetic disorder becomes very high. But at the very dawn of human history, the situation was completely different. According to the creation account in Genesis, Adam and Eve were directly created by God. When they were first made, their genetic makeup was perfect and unflawed, completely free from the inherited defects that arise from mutation. Therefore, when their first-generation children, Cain and his sisters, married, it was, from a genetic standpoint, perfectly safe. Their gene pool was like the purest spring water. Even if it mixed internally, there was no risk of producing a contaminated stream. It was only later, as human history progressed and factors like environmental radiation and random copying errors caused mutations to accumulate, that the human gene pool began to gather these tiny imperfections, like specks of dust slowly clouding that pure water. After hundreds or even thousands of years, as these genetic defects became more numerous, close-kin marriage finally became a high-risk activity that needed to be explicitly prohibited. So, from a purely biological perspective, in the infancy of the human race, unions between close relatives were not only safe but were the only possible way for the species to survive and multiply. It was a mathematical and biological necessity. The second level is that of moral law, and this is where misunderstandings most easily arise. Many people instinctively feel that if incest is wrong, it must be wrong in every era and under all circumstances. This is a kind of moral absolutism. But from the Bible's own narrative, we see that God's giving of the law was a gradual process, adapted to different stages of history. Do you know when the detailed legal statutes explicitly forbidding close-kin marriage first appeared? It was after Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, in the law of Moses delivered by God on Mount Sinai. These rules are written down in black and white in Leviticus chapter 18. This was an immense amount of time after the era of Cain, at least 1,500 years later. Before that point, there is no prohibition against close-kin marriage anywhere in the Bible. We cannot take a law that is over a millennium and a half in the future and travel back in time to punish someone who lived before that law ever existed. It would be like using modern anti-smoking regulations to fine a gentleman smoking a pipe in the 18th century. It's completely illogical. So why did God wait until the time of Moses to issue this law? The reasons are quite straightforward. On one hand, as we've discussed, after thousands of years of procreation, the genetic defects in the human population had accumulated to a point where the biological risks of close-kin marriage were significant. A law was needed to prevent this. On the other hand, the nation of Israel at that time was living among many pagan peoples with chaotic and profane sexual practices. God needed to establish holy laws of marriage to set his chosen people apart from these corrupting customs and build a morally sanctified society. The giving of the law was therefore tailored to the specific needs of that historical moment. In Cain's era, human society was incredibly simple, consisting of a single, large family. The most pressing command was to obey God's instruction to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Population growth was the primary imperative. Therefore, in that unique historical window, marriage between siblings was necessary and implicitly permitted by God. In fact, we can see traces of acceptable close-kin marriage later in the biblical text. For example, Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, married his wife Sarah, who, according to Genesis chapter 20, was his own half-sister. This demonstrates that before the law of Moses was given, this form of marriage was culturally accepted. The third level is that of narrative logic. We have to understand that the author of Genesis had a writing style and purpose completely different from a modern historian. He was not trying to write an exhaustive, detail-for-detail chronicle of events. His writing had a clear theological aim and was highly selective. He only recorded the people and events relevant to his core narrative, God's creation, humanity's fall, and the promise of redemption. Thinkers as far back as Augustine in the 4th century pointed to this very logic in his work The City of God, arguing that Adam and Eve must have had other children, whom the scripture simply doesn't name because they aren't central to the story of salvation. The author of Genesis would meticulously record the birth of Seth and his genealogy because Seth's line is the chosen thread that carries the divine promise forward. He wouldn't, however, stop to explain who Cain's wife was because, in his mind and for his original audience, the answer was self-evident and not the point of his story. For the original readers, it was natural to assume Cain's wife was one of his sisters. The author's silence is not evidence of a plot hole, but an indication that the matter required no explanation. The problem only arises for us, thousands of years later, living with entirely different social ethics and background knowledge. Now, when we combine these three levels of analysis, the biological, the legal, and the narrative, a complete picture emerges. That Cain's wife was his sister or niece was biologically safe at the time, morally and legally permissible as no law forbade it, and socially necessary for the continuation of the human race. And from a storytelling perspective, it was an assumed fact that the author saw no need to elaborate on. This seemingly startling answer is actually the most rigorous, the most faithful to the biblical text, and the one that best demonstrates the Bible's internal logical consistency. It fits like a perfectly cut puzzle piece into the ancient story, filling the gap that has troubled us for so long. At this point, the mystery of Cain's wife's identity can be considered solved. But our exploration cannot end here, because the significance of solving a riddle lies not just in finding the answer, but in contemplating where that answer leads us. The Bible's first mysterious woman ultimately points us toward a conclusion far grander and more profound than the question of who she was. It leads us to this: no matter where on earth we live today, what culture we have, or what language we speak, all of us share a common starting point. The story of Cain's wife, in its own ancient and even unrefined way, powerfully underscores the principle of a single human origin. We are, in fact, one massive, extended family. This idea might sound self-evident to us now, but for most of human history, it was an incredibly radical, even revolutionary, concept. In the ancient world, different tribes and nations would invent their own origin myths, often claiming to be descendants of gods while others were inferior, or not even truly human. This way of thinking has been the root of countless conflicts, enslavements, and genocides. But the author of Genesis, through this very story, tells his audience with absolute conviction that we all come from the same father and the same mother. Cain, the murderer, and Abel, the victim, shared the same blood. The family of Cain, who went on to build the first city, and the family of Seth, who inherited God's promise, both traced their lineage back to the same ancestor. This profound sense of universal kinship is the foundation of the entire biblical view of humanity. It is because of this shared origin that original sin can affect everyone, and it is also why God's salvation must be offered to everyone, because His grace is intended for every member of this great family. This is precisely what the Apostle Paul understood so deeply, which is why he could stand in Athens and declare that God, from one man made all the nations. That one man refers to one source, one common ancestor. Our entire process of solving this puzzle today also reveals an interesting phenomenon. When faced with the unknown and the inexplicable, we tend to have one of two inclinations. The first is to search outwardly. When we encounter a problem that doesn't fit our existing logic, our habit is to introduce a new, external element to resolve it. This is what the Pre-Adamite hypothesis does. It tries to fill a plot hole by inventing a character that wasn't originally in the story. This method is quick, easy, and often dramatic, but it usually undermines the original structure and meaning of the narrative. The second inclination is to dig inwardly. This approach requires us to believe that the answer is already hidden within the available information, we just haven't found it yet. It demands that we act like detectives, scrutinizing every small detail and re-examining things that seem mundane, like the long lifespans of early humans or the family members the author chose to omit. This method is certainly more difficult and requires more patience, but the conclusion it yields is far more solid and consistent with the whole. I believe this principle applies not only to interpreting ancient texts but to many situations in our lives. When we face confusion and challenges, do we quickly grasp for an external explanation to put our minds at ease, or do we quiet ourselves and search within the problem, and within ourselves, for the overlooked clues and possibilities? That is a question worth considering. The story of Cain's wife is almost like a joke the biblical author played on future generations, or perhaps, a brilliantly designed riddle left for us to solve. It seems a conspicuous logical gap was left intentionally, designed to make curious, truth-seeking readers pause and think deeply, rather than just skimming past. When you truly invest the effort, as we have today, to peel back the layers through analysis, deduction, and argumentation, you discover that this so-called plot hole is actually a masterfully crafted entrance. It guides you from a simple identity puzzle to a much deeper contemplation of time, family, law, human nature, and redemption. This, perhaps, is the true genius of these ancient texts of wisdom. They rarely offer a cheap, fast food answer. They always bury their most precious treasures in the places that require the most effort to dig, waiting for those explorers willing to invest the time and thought to unearth them.